Yeah, well, that's the pathology of identity politics. I mean, first of all, it's not white people that have all the power.
No, of course not.
It's some tiny fragment of white men who have most of the power, and only in a particular societal context. And what they have too is not only power. That everything is so radically oversimplified. I mean, most of the people who have the radical left people seem to regard the world as it's like a kindergarten contest where people are randomly awarded gold stars.
Yeah.
And some people happen to have more gold stars than others because they have shinier hats or something. They don't understand at all that a huge part of power, of what you might call power, is associated with a tremendous amount of responsibility, that it's also extremely difficult to maintain. They seem to think that if everybody was, they seem to think that monetary, let's say that material riches is an untrammeled reward, and it isn't associated with responsibility or work or anything like that. And it's partly because a lot of them are very low in conscientiousness. That's one of the predictors of radical left, of ideological possession. So,
See, that's very interesting, because I hear them say things like unearned power all the time, and I just sit and think, okay, who actually has unearned power? I mean, you could go back, 16th century aristocrat has unearned power, but none of the CEOs of a giant multinational corporation, their power was completely earned, probably at great expense to themselves, long hours, stressful working conditions and pressures and all this sort of thing. There's nothing unearned about their power.
Insane amount of responsibility and competition. I mean, I know a number of people like that, and I mean, they're not all out on their yachts with supermodels. Like, you do that for about a year and you're out of money. So,
and not only that, if they were to spend an inordinate amount of time away from their work, they would be superseded by their competitors within their own company.
Absolutely.
Yeah, and so these people have to work very, very hard, and I don't think that should be taken away from them. And I certainly despise the boiling it down to their race and gender being the factor that got them there. It's like, yeah, but how do you explain white men who aren't in that position then? It's just so simplistic. It's like something a child would come up with. Like you say, it's ridiculous.
Well, it's something that a not very bright child would come up with, or maybe a child that's already been damaged in some way, because the evidence that children are capable of fairly advanced moral reasoning, even very young, is quite overwhelming, increasingly overwhelming. And so I think you have to be taught a particularly pernicious ideology to buy this sort of nonsense. Because the fundamental assumption is the whole system is corrupt. It's based entirely on unearned power, and the way that unearned power is distributed is by race and gender. It's like, the thing is, maybe that's about 5 to 10% true, in that it is, I suspect, easier for men, all things considered, to obtain positions of power because they don't have to bear the same burden for child production that women do. And there are historical reasons why being Caucasian in a mostly Caucasian society is advantageous, because you're a more familiar entity, although that is transforming so utterly rapidly. I mean, 40% of the entrepreneurs in the United States are Indian. And the Asians in North America are just going great guns. And so these things are transforming as fast as anybody could possibly hope for them to transform. And a lot of that's just pure economics, is that even if you buy the radical left ideology and say that those who are engaged in capitalism are doing it for no other reason than greed, the greed is going to force people to hire the most competent people as rapidly as possible. And since greed supersedes everything, at least from that particular perspective, you can trust it at least.
Yeah, it's one of those wonderful logical proofs about the discrimination against women in the workplace. If you could hire women at 3/4 the cost of a man, why would anyone ever hire a man?
Well, that's exactly what's happened. That is what's happened. Their wages among the working class in particular have been flat since 1975. And the reason for that is that women work more cheaply and people hire them like mad.
Oh, do they?
And so what's happened is that because the labor force has doubled since 1973, roughly speaking, wages have remained flat. And women are suppressing wages because they'll work part-time and they'll work for less. And part of the reason for that is that they're more agreeable, and they're not as good at fighting for higher wages. the data on that's quite clear.
Oh, that's a
that
common
agreeable,
feminist complaint. One of the main things. I mean, the CEO of Reddit was a woman called Ellen Powell at one point. I think she's left now, but she wanted to ban negotiations for salary during a job hiring process on the basis that women tend to be less aggressive when they negotiate. And so, okay, but that's just characteristic of exactly everything I find abhorrent about social justice and the sort of thought process. I'm going to tear down other people because some people aren't as good. I'm sorry, if someone's good at negotiating, they deserve to get a little bit more because they put the effort in. They use their skills to advance themselves within the system, within the rules of the system. This is fair. Everyone should be trying to do that. And I'm saying that from the position of someone who's a terrible negotiator. And I don't think I've ever negotiated anything in my life when it comes to that.
Well,
but I don't think
the thing
that
is,
I should
it's not
tear other people down.
It's not a gender phenomena, actually. It's a personality phenomena.
Yes.
And like more agreeable men also have more difficulty negotiating. Now they have some advantages, is that it's easier for them to work in teams. They're better at things like customer service. They're somewhat better at managing interpersonal relationships because they're nicer. But the disagreeable types have their advantages. And one of the things we know, for example, is that disagreeable individuals make better managers because they're not easily taken advantage of and they can make tough decisions. And so, like, there are all sorts of factors that go into determining someone's pay, for example, and negotiating ability is one of them. It's not the biggest one by any stretch of the imagination, because conscientiousness and intelligence are much better predictors of salary than agreeableness, but agreeableness plays a role. And we won't be able to understand these things until we can actually take a real cold look at them without having to worry about whether our findings justify the gender is only a social construct argument and the a priori assumption that everyone's exactly the same except for how culture shapes them differently.